Okay, so we are going to cover chapters 5 and 6 tonight of the book of Esther. And if you want to take your notes, let's go to the top of page 34. Let's go ahead and review what we said in the last session. There was this ancient hatred that was between the Jews and the Amalekites that resurfaced here all the way in Persia. And one was coming from the descendancy of Mordecai the Jew, and the other one was Haman the Agagite. And he was an Amalekite, and so this old ancient hatred showed up once again. As we saw coming out of chapter 2, Mordecai should have been the one that was promoted because he spared the king's life, but we see Haman getting promoted. And so Mordecai refused to bow or pay homage, reverence. It was a word that's all the way through the Old Testament, almost 170 times used for worship. So he really wanted to be worshipped in a sense. But he comes up with this diabolical scheme to exterminate all the Jews. And he's willing to pay for it. And as we know from what we're going to read today in chapter 5, he had a lot of money, great riches. So either he was going to plunder the Jews or he's going to pull it out of his own bank account, but he was going to give 375 tons of silver to cover the costs. And I think, what did we say? It was $160 million by today's standard. So that was a lot. We looked at all the different ways that scheme was so demonic. One of the things that they did was they signed the decree on the day before Passover. So it was intentional, it was deliberate. They signed the decree on the day before Passover. They delivered the decree the next day. On the very day they're celebrating Passover, they're getting this decree that they're going to be exterminated. And of course, it had to get to the outlying areas, which would have taken some places almost 90 days to get to. But he set a date that was a year off, basically a year off, just so he could torment the people. It was a very evil and demonic day. But God had control even in the rolling of the dice, because that exact day that God allowed the dice to land on was to give the Jews plenty of time to arm themselves. As we know later on what happened when Mordecai came into power, Mordecai issued a decree that allowed the Jews to arm themselves and to fight against those people who were going to exterminate them. Well, you had to send the horses and the messengers all the way out again. And so his hand was in that whole situation to allow the Jews plenty of time to arm themselves and get ready for what was coming. So this news of this decree, it devastates the Jews, but God places this go-between, Hathach, and so Esther didn't have to expose herself. Hathach is there doing the communication between Queen Esther and Mordecai, and allows her to maintain her secret that she is a Jew until just the right time that she will reveal. She will perish if she does nothing, but she might die if she goes to the king unsummoned. So in the end, Mordecai tells her, you know what, this actually may be your life call, that you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. And as we're going to see right now, the result of Mordecai, Esther, Esther's maids, and all the Jews in Shushan, so there's probably several hundred people fasting, brings about a release of God's power that's really powerful. You begin to see it here in chapters 5 and 6, and it culminates in chapters 7 and 8. So let's read here from chapter 5. I want to read the whole chapter here as this new scheme comes up where Esther provides a banquet of wine to the king and Haman, and how Haman begins to boast about who he is and what he does. And then he gets this gallows ready by the advice of his wife and his friends. He gets this gallows ready for Mordecai, and it ends up being that that's where he's going to be hung on these gallows. So let's read here in chapter 5. It says, "Now it happened on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house, facing the entrance of the house. So it was, when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, that she found favor in his sight, and the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter. And the king said to her, 'What do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It will be given to you, up to half the kingdom.'" That's amazing that she had that kind of favor with him. So Esther answered, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him." This is going to become the key word in chapters 5, 6, and 7, is this word prepared. You're going to see it a lot. Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, that he may do as Esther has said." So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. Past tense, actually a perfect tense verb. At the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your request? It will be granted you. What is your your petition? It will be granted you. What is your request? Up to half the kingdom. It shall be done." He's insistent. See, Esther had tremendous favor. But then she shows her patience here. Then Esther answered and said, "My petition and my request is this: if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." So Haman went out that day joyful and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, so he's back now without sackcloth and ashes, he's back in his position as a judge, and that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman told them of his great riches, the multitude of his children, everything in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and servants of the king. "Moreover," Haman said, "besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet," notice this again, "that she prepared. And tomorrow I am again invited by her along with the king. Yet all this avails me nothing so long as I see Mordecai the Jew," that Jew, "sitting at the king's gate." Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Let a gallows be made 50 cubits high." So a cubit is about a foot and a half, about 18 inches. So if you have another translation, it will say 75 feet. The Hebrew says 50 cubits, and the newer translations translate it for us into English as 75 feet high. So this is a very tall structure. And in the morning, suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it. Then go merrily with the king to the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. He gets them ready. All right, so tonight we're going to talk about Esther's banquet. This was her first banquet. She holds actually 2 banquets. And we're going to talk about Mordecai being honored. And so let's talk about, first of all, we know from the context in the previous 2 verses in chapter 4 that all these people are fasting. So it was not only Esther and Mordecai, but it was Esther's maids, and also verse 16 says all the Jews who were present in Shushan. So again, there was probably several hundred. We don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us. They were fasting, and they joined Esther in this fast. And I see here, as we go into chapter 5, and with all the favor and with all the circumstances that suddenly turn against Haman, I see the power God released through this fasting. And I'm just reminded how many people fasted. And today I was looking at all the different fasts in the Bible. A lot of people fasted in the Bible. Moses fasted, Elijah fasted, Nehemiah fasted, Daniel fasted, Zechariah fasted, Jesus fasted, Anna fasted, Paul fasted, Cornelius fasted. David said, I humbled myself with fasting. And where we find really great deliverances for people, anyone who fasted, is when they fasted corporately, when a whole bunch of people got together to fast. The Israelites fasted for a breakthrough victory there in Judges 20. Samuel and the Israelites fasted for deliverance from the Philistines. That was really powerful how Samuel fasted, and he just clapped his hands, and God sent this terrible thunder against the Philistines that scared the daylights out of them. And Jehoshaphat and Judah fasted when they were surrounded by a large army, and again they didn't even have to fight. That was what was so awesome about that fast. They showed up there, and the people were already killing each other. And when they finally arrived there, everybody was dead. Everybody had killed one another. The Ammonites and the Moabites turned against the people from Mount Seir. They killed all those people off. And then the Ammonites and Moabites started fighting, and they killed each other off. And no one survived. Everybody died. And so when they went out, they just saw all the spoils. And it took them 3 days to gather all the spoils. The Ninevites, of course, fasted to avert judgment from God. Joel and Judah fasted in the book of Jude for repentance and restoration. And isn't that awesome? When they fasted there, all that the locusts had stolen, God says, I'm going to restore everything. All your harvests are going to be plentiful. Everything. You're going to have so much food, so much, everything's going to come to you. And that's when he gives the whole teaching on that in the last days, God's going to pour out his Spirit on all flesh. And it shows how the power of God got released and everything got restored. The early church fasted in the book of Acts for direction and guidance. Ezra and the returning Jews fasted for guidance and protection. Isaiah told us that if you fast, you'll break yokes, you'll set people free, you'll break people who are in chains, set them free. Jesus taught also that if we fast secretly, that God would reward us openly. And I want to say again tonight, after studying this, that fasting releases the power of God in our lives. And we've had it here, we've done it kind of secretly. Many of us have been fasting for certain things, and we're seeing the power of God released in people's lives. So I encourage all of you that if you're able to fast, to do it. Get other people to fast with you together in a corporate fast, and watch the power of God move as you fast secretly. You don't have to tell everybody, you don't have to put on a sad face, but you fast. And we could use some fasting, because most people at church like to eat, and we eat, and we call a potluck, and 500 people will show up. You call a prayer and fasting, like 3 people will show up, So we need to learn how to fast. And I believe in these last days, we're going to need to fast, because there's going to be so many terrible things come against us that we're going to have to be fasting people. And if you're not preparing yourself right now to fast, then you're going to fast when it gets bad. You got to learn how to fast right now while everything's going fine. Learn how to fast. Practice fasting. And God will show you his power when you fast. Because of God's grace and the Jews' fast, Esther had powerful faith. She had overwhelming favor. She also had the Lord's discernment and wisdom. And no doubt about it, this banquet she set up sealed Haman's doom. And it was very powerful. I want to tell you, when Esther went into the presence of the king, we're kind of all nervous because she hadn't been summoned, right, in 30 days. We're all nervous because anyone who did do that, no matter who you were, your head got chopped off right there. So all of us are in suspense. But I want to tell you that Esther went in there with total confidence. And we have to ask ourselves, how do we know that? Well, if you look down at verse 4, she already had a banquet ready. And in verse 5, she says the banquet is already ready. She already had the banquet prepared before she even stepped in front of the king. She was waiting for the king to just say yes, and she would walk in. She goes, hey, I have a banquet already ready for you. So that's powerful. She had to have full confidence. We're here worried about our neck, She goes, you know what? God has got this so good. I'm going to go ahead and prepare all the enchiladas and everything, and the wine and the strawberries, everything that this king likes. She already had it done before she even stepped in front of him. Wow. So that's faith. That was somebody who believed. She had it already prepared. And even Haman in verse 12 said, the king, I was the one that was invited to this banquet that she already prepared. She already had it done. She was on it already. And so we know that she walked in total faith. And also we know that she had favor. Over and over says she has favor. Verse 2, she found favor right away in his sight, just like that. And right away he extends a scepter. There was no hesitation. And on top of that, I mean, that is amazing favor, is it not, in verse 3, that he's willing to give her up to half of the kingdom. And the Persian Empire was the kingdom that extended really through the whole known world, 127 provinces, thousands of miles wide. He's willing to give her half the kingdom. And she didn't even, isn't it amazing? She didn't even ask for anything. She just showed up. But we do know that for her to risk that, the king knew, man, she must want something real serious for her to do this and come in unannounced. She's got something on her mind. But notice that Esther didn't say, King, please, I've got this huge... No, he said to her, what do you want? I'll give you whatever you want, up to half the kingdom. So that just shows you the tremendous favor that she had. I like what Swindoll says there at the bottom of the notes there. What can I do for you? Name it. There's no limit. It's yours. I'll give it to you. That's basically what the king was saying to her. Job says this, Vashti risked her life by refusing to appear before Xerxes when summoned. And another of the story's ironies, Esther now risks her life by appearing before the same king unsummoned. So one didn't come while summoned. This one came and she was unsummoned. So again, the twists and the turns in the book of Esther, they're just amazing. The king knew that if Esther came like this, at risk of her own life, she must have had something very important in her mind. And it's true. So while Esther is fasting, she's also preparing a banquet. But she's actually going to fatten up Haman for the kill. That's what she's doing. She knows that God is going to work this out. And it's amazing, not only it's amazing to sit and listen to how Esther talks to the king, especially as you get into chapters 7 and 8 and right here. She just knows how to talk to him. And I mean, think, man, this lady had some words. She just knew how to say the right words to him. And I believe God gave her that grace to be able to talk to the king the way she did. And she knew what they liked, right? These guys like to drink wine. Right? You know that from the first chapters, right? Even when they made the decree, Haman and the king sat down to drink wine. And he provided wine at that 180-day banquet and the 7-day banquet. It was all drinking and wine. So consequently, these two banquets that she has, they're banquets of wine. Now you say, again, we don't impose our Christian morals on what she was doing. She just knew how to deal with them. And she knew what would please them, and so she knew how to speak with them with wisdom and tact, and she did it really, really well. And I think we'll get to that part where how she talks to the king, I think, is a good way that we ought to talk to our king. In fact, I'll just mention it right now. My wife and I, when we were reading through the book of Esther, I hope she doesn't mind me saying it, but she says, I think we should talk to the Lord that way. If I have found favor in your eyes, and if it pleases you what I'm requesting, grant me what I'm asking for. I think we ought to talk to God that way. It's like He's the King of Kings. And it can't be like we're demanding, but if we found favor in your eyes, Father, and it pleases you what we're requesting, then grant what we're asking. Man, that's a powerful way to pray, I think. So I think I'm going to start doing that more often. Laniak says, compared to the king inviting the queen in chapter 1, Esther is reversing the roles of that opening scene by inviting the king to her banquet. The king invited Vashti to his, and now she's inviting the king to hers. And we have to ask the question, why did Esther wait? Why not take advantage of the king's favor? I mean, in verse 6, he says, what is it? Tell me. I'll give it to you. Up to half the kingdom, it shall be done. I don't know, if I was right there, I would have said, off with Haman's head right now. You know, I would have already said it. But it's amazing how restrained she was. He thought Haman was restrained when he didn't come against Mordecai. She had to be really restrained and know and discern that things are not in the right place yet. So somehow Esther had a sense that things were not quite, the timing wasn't right, in other words. That we needed Haman to come forth with his full arrogance and set up the very trap by which he would be hung on the gallows. And like I write here, Esther gave him time to build his own gallows. She gave him time to do that. And Esther played on Haman's pride, right? The only person I want at this banquet is Haman. So Haman went home right away and boasted about that very thing. Esther knew how to size this guy up. And she sure did. So God intervenes again because you guys know this from what we've already seen in the story. King Ahasuerus is a very angry guy. And any little thing sets him off. And you would think that when Esther said it, you know what, let's just wait another day. He could have said, no, I want to know right now. And if not, off with your head. And he doesn't. He just says, oh, okay, let's do it that way. And so again, we see God's favor in her life. And somehow he's willing to wait another day, so he still has her favor. We see in verse 9 that Mordecai is now back at the king's gate. In verse 9 we see that, and also Haman mentions it in verse 13. He's sitting at the king's gate. The only way you could get near the gate was you could not be wearing sackcloth and ashes, which is what he was wearing in chapter 4, and that's why he couldn't get near to where Esther was. You couldn't get anywhere near the palace being sad or wearing sackcloth. So somehow now he's fasted his 3 days too, and now he's back at his position. He must be assured that God is going to do something because he's back in his position. He's not mourning anymore. But before, if you remember, Haman was requiring that everybody bow down and pay homage or worship him. Now it says that he did not stand or tremble or be fearful before him. And that filled him with rage. So he was wanting anything from Mordecai. And he wouldn't bow, he wouldn't stand, he wouldn't fear, he wouldn't do anything, wouldn't worship. So that just enraged him some more. And I began to wonder also, because Haman is such a powerful official, and he's basically the number 2 guy below the king, it's amazing that he just didn't order Mordecai arrested, you know. Why not just arrest the dude, you know? Send the servants to arrest him. Again, God's behind the scenes preventing all of that from happening. And if you think through some of these things, you'd think, why don't these things take place? And we see the restraining hand of God in all of it. Even Haman restraining himself in verse 10, I believe, was God. God was telling him, you know, back off, Haman, it's all right. You're going to get hanged in just a little bit. So God was working everything behind the scenes. In verse 10, we find the first mention of Haman's wife, Zeresh. And she's mentioned again in verse 14. And she is a woman that I've said right at the very beginning who becomes a very tragic figure in this whole story, because as we're going to see, the 75-foot high gallows is going to be out right in front of her house. And that's where her whole family is going to get hung. And what a sad, I thought Job had it bad. I think that would be a really bad situation. So, but here in verse 11 and 12, we just see the haughtiness of Haman, right? He boasts about his great riches, his kids, his promotion, all that he has. Nobody's invited but me. And his riches, of course, were so, like Baldwin says, such a priority that they're even before his 10 sons that he has. But Esther knew the king, and Esther knew Haman. And Esther knew what the king liked. He liked wine and feasting. And Esther also knew Haman was a very proud man. So everything that Esther does in this banquet sizes both of these guys up. She's just working them, and she knows how to work them, and she knows the perfect timing on when to do stuff. She's a master of detail. She even has the banquet done in advance before she even shows up. She can discern the people's hearts. And so you can see the power of God that's on Esther, that she's even willing to wait for another banquet before she springs this trap on on Haman. So she, I believe, is very sensitive to the Lord's direction. Everything was not quite in place during the first banquet, but it will be in the next banquet when she fattens him up for the day of slaughter. All right, let's go to the top of page 37. You can almost hear the venom in Haman's voice when he calls Mordecai the Jew. That Jew, some translation, that Jew Mordecai. He just hated him with a passion. Baldwin says the idea in this verse is that all his gains are outweighed by the one killjoy, Mordecai. And in his present mood, Haman's irritation is becoming beyond endurance. And isn't it interesting that as we get to verse 14, we're going to see that they're not even willing to wait until this decree, which is many months away. Haman's wife tells them, have him hanged in the morning. They're not even going to wait any more time. They're going to hang this guy in the morning. So now the pressure is really on, right? The issue is not the decree that's still many months away. The issue now, Mordecai's life is in danger, for sure. Because if Haman had just walked in, right? If Haman had just walked into the king and the king had gone to sleep that night, Mordecai would have been hung the next day. Pretty sure. But God intervened at the last minute, like Frank said, like the last minute, God intervened and made sure the king didn't sleep that night. God had it all worked out. Laniak says this, Haman has now twice concocted plans that will backfire on him. The date that was set to witness the widespread destruction of the Jews will become the day of executing those who hate the Jews. Isn't that amazing? The day Haman set to execute the Jews ends up being the day that the Jews execute people that try to kill them. So it all gets turned around. The very gallows he intended for Mordecai to be executed for being a Jew, will make Haman the first to be executed for opposing the Jews. So the very things, all the things that Haman concocts ends up turning against him. Job says, Haman builds a gallows of extraordinary size, 75 feet high. Can you imagine that? That's more than 7 stories high. He wanted everybody to see it, not realizing that it's the size is the measure of his own pride. I mean, he just was a very arrogant man. And he's not going to wait until the 13th day of the 12th month of Adar, which is March. He wants Mordecai dead right now. So now God's going to have to intervene for Mordecai's sake. So the pressure's on. Not really even for Esther now, but Mordecai's life is at stake. So chapter 6 comes along. And there's no doubt we see the providence of God here, maybe more than any other place in the whole book of Esther. Because here, the king can't sleep that night. He has insomnia for the night. And what does he do? What does a king do when he can't sleep? What do they normally do? You guys know the stories, right? You've seen the movies, you've read history books on it, right? They call for musicians, they call for dancers, they call for a woman. They call for everything, right? They can call for anything they want. They can call for a double hamburger in the middle of the night, right? They can call for whatever they want. If they wanted a steak dinner, they can call it, eat it, and then go to sleep. But of all the things that he could ask for, he asked for the congressional record of his reign. And we know historically, we know it from the Greek histories, we know it from what has been discovered among the Persian ruins and all the archaeology, is that the Persians were meticulous keepers of records. They recorded every single event that ever happened in the Persian Empire. So remember, how long was it between the time that Mordecai spared the king's life and when Haman concocted his plan? It was more than 4 years, right? Chapter 2 to chapter 3 was more than 4 years. So an empire that big, 127 provinces, this king making these decisions and military decisions and decisions about everything under the sun for all those 127 provinces, you can believe that there were a whole bunch of scrolls everywhere for his reign just in the last 4 years. You can imagine that there was a lot of things that had happened. So this king says, go get me a scroll from the back library. And there had to be, I don't want to exaggerate, but let's just say there was a couple of hundred scrolls. I would say there were probably thousands of scrolls, but let's just say there was a couple of hundred scrolls for the sake of argument. And this guy, servant, goes over there, this eunuch, and he goes and he grabs the one scroll. Out of all the scrolls, he grabs the one that happens to be the one that says when Mordecai spared the king's life. Out of all the scrolls. That's totally God. I mean, no way that anybody could have concocted that. So they opened the scroll, and he didn't read, he didn't try to put him to sleep by reading. So when he opens it up, he's reading how Mordecai told about Bigthana and Teresh, these two guys who tried to lay hands on the king. And now, all of a sudden, this king goes, man, we didn't even honor him? Did anybody do anything to honor him? And right when that decree had been signed, right in his presence back at the end of chapter 2, he does nothing. Now all of a sudden, he's wanting to do something right away. Now remember, we have to remember verse 1 starts out with that night. So I don't know what time a king goes to bed. But let's just say he went to bed at 9 or 10 o'clock. And let's just say it is 11, 12 o'clock, and he's still flipping, turning back and forth, and he can't sleep. So you have to remember, this is pretty late at night, or maybe even early in the morning. So think about that. I mean, let's just, again, I don't want to exaggerate a time, but let's just say it's 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning. By the time the guy went to the library and got the scroll and came back and started reading it, let's just say it's 1 o'clock in the morning, right? What are the chances that that's the very time that Haman is leaving his house to show up at the king's courtyard at the very moment that the king wants to honor Mordecai? What are the chances that the guy that's out in the courtyard is Haman? And what are the chances that he's coming to tell the king, I want to hang Mordecai, and the king is trying to think of, how am I going to honor Mordecai? What are the chances that can all happen by chance? There's no way. This is too much. And that's how, and isn't it amazing, because Haman is so enraged that he can't even wait till 5 or 6 in the morning or 7 or 8 in the morning. He wants to do it right now. And God takes the very wrath of Haman and sets it all up so that he shows up in the courtyard at the very moment the king wants to honor Mordecai in the middle of the night. Whoever honors a guy at 1 in the morning, or whatever time it is, at 11 at night, whoever does that? Well, this king does it right here. And again, we see the providence of God. So, As Swindoll says, while Haman and his gang are constructing gigantic gallows, Ahasuerus struggles with insomnia. And of all those entries that the king had in his reign, that they would absolutely go and find the one entry that was for Mordecai. Wow, amazing. So isn't it something, though, that God not only used Mordecai to save the Jews, God also used Mordecai to save the king. And so he was a very amazing person, what Mordecai did. Talk about a bizarre situation. Haman is out there building a gallows so he can hang Mordecai. And meanwhile, in the palace in the middle of the night, the king is trying to find a way to honor Mordecai. One to hang, the other to honor. And it's going to clash right there in front of the king. And it's going to be a humiliation for Haman. And so now we see why the king forgot. God made sure he forgot back there in chapter 2, more than 4 years earlier, because God had this perfect timing all set up. Isn't that amazing? God's foreknowledge. He saw all this in advance. He knew he was going to make the king not sleep one night, and he was going to have it where they went and got the very scroll that they needed to honor Mordecai right at the moment that Haman is planning to hang him. What an amazing turnaround. Haman doesn't need like others because he is one of the closest advisors. And if you remember, those 7 nobles, they saw the king's face, which meant they did not have to request permission to come in. So Haman was one of those people that could come right in if he wanted to, and he's coming in the middle of the night. And he doesn't even have to ask because the king says, who's out there in the courtyard? And it just happened to be that Haman's out there, so let him come in. He doesn't have to knock on the door, just let him walk right on in right now. He's walking into this trap that's set up by God. And here's another thing. The king, right, he could have said, hey, Haman, what should we do for Mordecai since he spared my life? What do we ought to do for Mordecai? Right here, they're just reading me. Haman, what do you think? What do you think we should do for Mordecai? No, the whole conversation is, what should we do for the man the king wants to honor? So even the words that the king said out of his mouth were orchestrated by God. Because Haman sits there, and you know, because of his arrogance and his vanity, who does the king want to honor besides me? It's got to be me. Little knowing that what comes out of his mouth is going to promote Mordecai. What an amazing story. And it's mentioned in verse 6, verse 7, verse 9 twice, and verse 11. They never say Mordecai. They never say, he didn't say, Haman, I want to honor you, or I want to honor Mordecai. It just says, what do we do with the man whom the king delights to honor? Well, even the words are ordered by God. And even the question, again, I want to just reiterate that point, is from the Lord. The question the king's asked. It was a setup. Notice the king didn't say, hey, Haman, what do you think I ought to do for Mordecai since he spared my life? There's no mention of Mordecai, and there's no mention of Haman either. And Baldwin says, Haman inadvertently promotes Mordecai. And right away, of course, he quickly lists all the stuff that he wants for himself. Think about it. If Haman is the guy, he's thinking in his own mind, this promotion is for me. How much more can you be promoted? The only other person above you is the king, right? So it's like, well, the only other promotion I can get is I got to get rid of you, king, and then I can be the full king. So if you'll notice what Haman says here, everything is about being like a king, right? Because he says, put on this person a royal robe that the king has worn. Let this person ride a horse that the king has ridden in. Put a royal crest, and only the king could have the royal crest on a horse. So basically Haman is saying, I want to be honored as the king. Like as a king. I'm the king of this whole thing. Little knowing that the whole time it was what he was going to have to do for Mordecai. Now, honestly, I would have loved to have been in the locker room when Haman is putting the robe on Mordecai and getting the horse ready. I would have loved to be there to see what kind of expression. And I would have loved to see what Mordecai was doing, getting on top of that horse. I would have just loved to see it. I wish we could have a video camera of it where what was going on as Mordecai is just sitting on top of that horse as he's putting the royal crest on that horse. Oh, man. I wonder, I don't know, if I was Mordecai, I would have just been saying, man, you're eating some humble pie right now. You are eating some big-time humble pie. And I believe it's true that this has got to be the most ironic comic scene in the whole Bible. This has to be such a turn of events, so amazing, where a guy puffs himself up completely, the very enemy that he wants to kill, and he ends up having to honor that guy in the most profound way. It's amazing. And Swindoll is right. Nowhere in chapters 5 and 6 does Mordecai utter a single word. Mordecai doesn't say, thank you, king, for what you did for me. He went right back to where he was. When it was all over, he just went right back to sit where he was before. And so this is a very terrible thing here. Let's go ahead and read it here. When he finally tells him, chapter 6, verse 10, when he finally tells him, here's what you ought to do, king. Here's what the king tells Haman. Then the king said, chapter 6, verse 10, then the king said to Haman, hurry up, do this right away. Take the robe and the horse, as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai, I love this, the Jew who sits within the king's gate. And I think this last sentence is just a classic thing that God just added spice to the whole thing. Leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken. Because Haman could have just, all right, I'm just going to put the robe on you and we're going to go outside real fast. Nope. He goes, I want you to do exactly what you said. And make sure you do all of it. Don't leave anything undone. Wow. Well, we see here maybe more than anywhere else. Well, I'm sure there's many examples, Satan and different people who fell, but whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Baldwin says, the words Haman had to proclaim must have been gravel in his mouth. And in the eyes of the crowd, he was already finished. Swindoll says, Mordecai returned to the king's gate because that's where he'd been all the time. His roll had not gone to his head. And isn't it interesting, later on as we get into the chapter 8 and 9, especially chapter 10, we're going to see he's promoted to the highest place. He's wearing a crown, he's wearing royal robes, all given to him by the king. He never asked for it, he never wanted it, and God honored him all the way to make him the most powerful ruler in all of Persia. And he was a Jew. It's amazing how God exalted Mordecai, especially in chapter 10. And to this day, thousands and thousands of Jewish families name their kids Mordecai in honor of this man. Luke chapter 1, Jesus, when it's talking there, Mary makes this statement here about God. He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts. And he has put down the mighty from their thrones, but he has exalted the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty. And here in verse 13, twice, Zeresh, Haman's wife, tells him, you have begun to fall before Mordecai, right? Before whom you have begun to fall, verse 13. Says it again, surely, but will surely fall before him. Wow. Laniak says, notice that Haman is not simply falling, he is falling before Mordecai. The very person he wanted to bring down, he's falling before that person. And also to hear his own wife say in verse 13, this guy's of Jewish descent. He's a Jew, and because of that, you're not going to prevail against him. Wow. How could his wife come up with something like that? We see here, don't we, again, in Romans 8:31, if God is for us, who can be against us? And one translation says, if God is for us, no one can defeat us. And we can't. Mordecai never bowed the knee, and he was exalted by God in a very profound way. And even after he got exalted, he went right back to doing what he was doing before. He didn't allow anything to get to his head. But what a tremendous fall here is beginning to take place for Haman. And he doesn't even have time to think about what's going on when they come and whisk him away in the last verse. Haman is now, he always was, but more fully we see that he's in God's hands. Haman has lost all control. He can't even stop to think about what's happening. They're already coming to pick him up in the chariot to take him to another banquet that Esther already has ready for him. Verse 14, the last words, it's the banquet which Esther had prepared already. Hebrew perfect tense, meaning it was already done well in advance. Esther was already getting the next banquet done. She was just cleaning the dishes, and they were cleaning the dishes for her. They were made. She was already getting the next banquet ready to go for him. So we see this preparation that's taking place in chapters 5 through 7. Esther's preparing a banquet in advance. Haman is preparing a gallows in advance. And it all ends up dovetailing to a place where Haman gets hanged on those gallows that he was preparing for Mordecai. It was all a setup for the Lord. Everything was done in advance. Everything was ready before it even came. And we see God overruling in this entire story completely. And when we get to the next chapter 7, once again, he's asking, what is it that you want? And that's when she springs the whole thing on him, and Haman gets taken out of the way and gets hanged in the very gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. So, again, a very amazing story of timing, a very amazing story of God's providence. And once again, we want to remind ourselves the Holy Spirit deliberately, intentionally left God's name out of this. At so many points, they could have said, the Lord, God did this. God was behind this. And again, there's no mention of God. There's no mention of Lord, so we can see it. Because that's the way God works in our lives. He's working things behind the scenes. He's working timing out that we didn't even know could exist. But as we trust Him and we rely on Him, we see that God's able to do that. So praise God. And next week's teaching, we go through chapter 7 and 8, is going to be very powerful, because now the thing that's still going is that decree, and that decree is going to get turned on its head as well. And in the end, the Jews are going to actually celebrate out of that whole decree. What Haman meant for evil, God turned it around for their good. So praise God for that. All right, any questions?